On the Saturday morning, 1 week before our wedding, my church had a congregational meeting to fire our pastor. He had absolutely none, zilch, of the administrative skills needed to be pastor of a church. As you can imagine, there were a fair number of members who simply knew he was a nice man who preached fine sermons. The vote carried, and that was his last day as our pastor. We were married by our assistant pastor, a young woman who had never performed a wedding, and a presbytery executive who was a friend of my mom's. Our wedding was fine. I lost my place. But I will never forget the bewilderment and anger of some of our members and the division in the congregation at that congregational meeting, and the fact that they soldiered on and are still a strong and wonderful church. I tell you this story so that you will understand why my reaction to the events of last year was somewhat different than many people's. I was not too happy that both our pastors were leaving, and I was not happy about the division in the congregation that some of that caused. But I had been there before, and I knew that we would be okay eventually. In the months after that, the pastor's leaving, as I was busy planning worship and getting ready for Christmas Eve, I was very grateful for our secretary, Lisa Picaro. Denise Trewicki and Rebecca and I had been working hard together to plan worship, and we'd send it to Lisa, and she would make it all look good in the bulletin and print it. So as you can imagine, when I found out 3 days before her last day, I freaked out a little bit that she was quitting. She was quitting. I freaked out a little bit. Actually, I freaked out a lot. In fact, I had a bit of a panic attack. I had to take a lot of deep breaths and keep reminding myself that it would be okay. God is doing a new thing. For a couple of days, my response to that is, God's new things are hard. I still think that sometimes. The thing is, I do have confidence that God is doing a new thing at Grace Covenant, and that we truly are on God's path. You may wonder how I can be so confident and so hopeful, considering everything that has happened. I'll tell you, I can't help it. I have seen so many signs of God's guidance in worship and worship planning in the last few months that I am filled with hope. From the very first meeting that worship team had, after finding out both our pastors were leaving, God has been guiding us. At that September meeting, we started making a list of people we could invite to preach for us, and one of the first on the list was Sarah Hayden. Now, as you may remember, Sarah grew up at Grace Covenant and currently lives in Atlanta. Hillary Schmidt messaged her right then and there on her phone, and we found out that Sarah was already planning to be in town the Sunday before Thanksgiving. Great! And then later that week, realized after talking to Marcia Turner that Liam Hussey needed to be baptized. And since Sarah grew up with Emily Hussey and knew Ryan from youth group, it would be perfect for Sarah to baptize him. I felt like we had stumbled onto a plan that God had already made. Later that fall, when I was emailing Sarah about plans for that November 22nd worship service, she said she wanted to have people write on note cards something they were grateful for. Coincidentally, we were already planning to do something very similar with the tags to hang on trees. So we wove them together, and they're still in Heartland Hall. I thought, wow, God, you're good. So we continued to plan worship services. We didn't have a preacher scheduled for November 8th, and it just came to me that we had not celebrated our 30th anniversary yet. Worship team members had great suggestions about the worship structure, and we worked from there. We came up with a big list of people who could speak. I got a few of them lined up and just told them to tell a 2 or 3 minute story about something they loved about GCPC. I thought about making sure that everything was organized and they weren't talking all about the same thing and picking scriptures to go with what they were going to say and la-da-da. But frankly, I didn't feel like it, and we really didn't have that much time. So I just decided to let go and let God. It could not have been more perfect. Nobody could have organized it as well as God did. Every single person was fabulous. Everything they talked about was different from what other people talked about, and it was wonderful. And if you missed it, go to the church website, gcpc.org, scroll down to the bottom of the first page. There's a blue box that says sermons. Click on it. You'll have a list of various different Sundays, and you can find November 8th. Click on it, and it will take you to a YouTube video of those speakers. If you did not see it, go back and check it out. So what I have to say about that is, you go, God. For Advent, the worship team came up with a theme, embracing expectation. In my emails with the guest preachers for Advent, among the other things I had to tell them about preaching at Grace Covenant and how things work here, I told them about our theme. Except I forgot to mention it to Sally Wright, who preached December 22nd. So as I sat right there in that first pew, and she started to preach, I went, oh, I forgot to tell her the theme. Oh well, too late now. But before long, it was clear I didn't need to tell her the theme. God had given her the message much better than I ever could. Her sermon could not have been more perfect. My eyes filled with tears, and I wondered how, after everything that had happened, I could have doubted that God had my back. I'm sure that last year, when we were going through the controversy about Jonas, a lot of you felt like we were not doing what God wanted us to do. We were not on the path God wanted us to take, in more ways than one. But I'm here to tell you now that God has a plan for us. And God is using us, all of us, to make that happen, whether we know it or not. Sometimes whether we want to or not. In Paul's letter to the Romans, he said, "We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to God's purpose." That does not mean that God allows bad things to happen or makes bad things to happen because it's part of God's plan. It does mean that God can make something good even out of something bad. Take the shooting in Charleston last summer at the church. A white supremacist brutally murdered 9 people. He thought his actions would start a race war. Instead, there was an outpouring of compassion and support and a cascade of events that resulted in the Confederate flag being taken down at universities, cities, all over the South, and even the state of South Carolina took theirs down. It was a symbol of slavery and hate, and people finally realized that it was part of their past and not part of their future. God did something really good with something really bad. All we have to do in these difficult times is to turn to God for comfort and guidance and follow where God leads. Last week, we celebrated Epiphany. Technically, it's still Epiphany. I'm wearing my star. It's the second Sunday. Actually, I think it's the second Sunday after Epiphany, technically, is what it is in the church calendar. Last week in his sermon, Brian Ellison talked about the Magi following the light of the star. He said, that star still shines, and it shines for us. The star does shine for us. And I'm not talking about the general us, all Christians, or all people of God, or people in the United States, or Johnson County, or Heartland Presbytery. I'm talking about us right here in this church. God's light shines for us and leads us. Brian described the star as God's guiding light that leads us out of darkness. God is leading us out of the darkness of uncertainty, out of the darkness of anger and hurt feelings, into the light of forgiveness and a new sense of purpose of who we are. Somewhere out there is the person God has picked to be our interim pastor. I know this with every fiber of my being. By the way, I have to digress here for a second and mention that my husband George does not like the term interim pastor. He says we should call them a transitional pastor. It is not someone to fill a spot until we hire a real pastor, but someone who will help us through this transition. Whatever you call them, she or he will be trained and skilled in reconciliation and will help us to heal and forgive and to listen to each other, to move forward and to learn how not to repeat the mistakes we made in the past. They will help us figure out who we are and who we want to be. We are just waiting for the time to be right, God's time, for that person and our search team to connect. I told you about some of the signs that I have seen that God is leading us. I want to tell you about one more, and that is all of you. You have stepped up in so many great ways, helping with teams, helping with projects, just offering words of support. I cannot tell you, a week does not go by when I do not have at least 2 or 3 people saying, what can I do to help? Please give me something to do. I'll do it at home at night while I'm watching TV. Or, you're doing a great job. Thank you so much. And the worship team rocks. I am not doing this by myself. You see me here. I am the face of the worship team, but I certainly could not do that without them. They are wonderful. So you are part of what is making us follow God's path. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote, God travels wonderful paths with human beings. God does not arrange matters to suit our opinions and views, does not follow the path that humans would like to prescribe for God. God's path is free and original, beyond all our ability to understand or to prove. Let me repeat part of that. God does not follow the paths human would like to prescribe to God. God's path is free and original, beyond all our ability to understand. I don't know where God is leading us, but I know we're being led. So take heart, believe, and follow God's light. God is doing a new thing at Grace Covenant, and it's going to be awesome. Amen.